people from their country into Western capitals where this money gets reinvested.
The Economic and Financial Crimes Commission says it has recovered jewelry worth millions of naira from the house of one Aka Baba Danagundu, a brother-in-law to Major General Abdullahi Mukhtar, the former National Security Advisor to the late President Umar Yar'Adua.
Wow. So those stories are difficult to watch, particularly when we remember that corruption is never just about missing money or abused public office, but that behind every scandal are peoples whose rights have been violated, children denied an education, patients left without health care, communities deprived of clean water, housing, livelihoods, and justice. For too long, corruption has been treated primarily as a criminal justice issue. But what if we also approached it as a human rights issue? What if victims could use the law not only to punish corruption, but to seek accountability, remedies, and lasting institutional reform? So those are the questions at the heart of a new publication that will be launching very soon, entitled Litigating Corruption as a Human Rights Issue in Africa, a Practitioner's Guide. And it's the first in IHRDA's new series of practical strategic litigation guides, which are designed to equip lawyers, civil society organizations, and human rights defenders with practical tools to use litigation to advance justice across the continent. And now I'm delighted to be joined by the author, Professor Prosper Shimbarashe Magushu, an internationally respected scholar whose work has helped shape thinking on the relationship between corruption, accountability, and human rights. And I'm also joined by Dr. Musa Kika, a constitutional human rights lawyer and the executive director of the Institute for Human Rights and Development in Africa. So Dr. Musa will be asking the questions, but please send your questions in too through the chat, and we'll try to get through as many of them as possible. Thank you all for joining us for this, what I hope will be a very interesting conversation. Musa, over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Maimuna. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues from wherever you are joining us from. Delighted that you could make time to be with us, and it's good to connect also with an old colleague and friend, Professor Shimbarashe Magushu. So I'll call you Simba, Prof, throughout the conversation. So over the next 1 hour or so, we are going to have a dialogue with Simba on the topic at hand, litigating anti-corruption as a human rights issue. I have prepared a number of questions that I will throw at him for him to shed a bit of light on this subject, but I'll be inviting you, the audience, to write questions and comments on the chat. We will see them, and some of them will extract them and throw them at Simba. And then in between, I will also turn to you for those who have something to say, a question to ask. Just raise your hand. We will be able to pick your hand and allow you to also interact with Simba. All right. Fantastic. So let me start with a couple of questions. And I'm going to start with the very beginning, Simba. The connection between human rights and corruption, the doctrinal issues, if you will. Okay, there was a sound at the background. So typically, corruption is framed as an economic or a governance issue rather than a human rights one. Sometimes it's captured as a criminal issue. Sometimes people think of corruption in terms of just stolen money or government scandals. But from where you sit, what is the strongest doctrinal argument that can be put forward in terms of linking corruption and human rights, corruption as a human rights violation itself? And why would a shift in thinking be important, particularly in our context, where we are trying to shift the thinking into corruption as a human rights issue?
Well, two very important questions there. But first, hello, Musa. Hello, colleagues joining online, and thank you very much for having me. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. Yeah, so the first question first, yeah. And I think, colleagues, you can already deduce my answer after watching that very disturbing video. I said disturbing because this is really the reality of so many countries. I don't know where you're joining from, but I would say, to cut the long story short, perhaps the strongest argument is that corruption is now beyond just governance failure and economic crime. You can see clearly from the videos, various clips shown, that it directly interferes with the enjoyment of human rights. Corruption diverts public resources that should be used to satisfy human rights, whether we're talking of socioeconomic rights or civil and political rights. And by the way, I hate that distinction, and I don't think it serves any purpose. But if you look at it, if we are forced to use it, you can see that clearly in the example, with the example of socioeconomic rights, they are enjoyed subject to the availability of resources. Yeah. And if you can show clearly that the resources are being diverted to buy palatial homes elsewhere, then there is a direct relationship between that act of corruption and the violation of human rights. So that's the strongest link here. That, there is some clear relationship between human rights violations and certain acts of corruption. So to view corruption through the lens of human rights is very important because it reminds us that behind every act of corruption are real victims whose dignity and rights have been affected. And this is all about the African Union is all about humans. That's why even our charter on human rights is the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. So it's about humans, about people. So it's about the dignity of the victims of corruption. So framing corruption from a human rights perspective can also help to shape the perceptions that corruption does actually kill. Corruption is a crime, and it is not, contrary to what many think, a victimless crime. They are victims of corruption. So in a nutshell, this I believe is the strongest argument. We need to move beyond governance and criminal domains and view corruption from the perspective of human rights and humanizes the fight against corruption.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll come back to the issue of victims because that's very important. But before that, so part of what you see is that human rights practitioners and anti-corruption practitioners tend to operate from separate corners. Rarely do you see them in one room like we are having this morning. What do you think these practitioners or actors would achieve or could achieve if they were to come together and work together, seeing that there is a direct link between human rights and corruption?
Yes, that's very true. That's very true. And that has been going on for a long time, given the fact in which the two fields have developed. And human rights law itself is also fairly a recent field, post. And at that time was really quite, I can say, caught up in this dispute between communism and capitalism. So we ended up with these two doctrines. Socioeconomic rights were not really regarded as justiciable, as rights that one can go to court and claim. And then with corruption, it's even far worse. Corruption was tolerated until very recently, still even being tolerated in some countries today. They don't really criminalize certain acts or all acts that we may regard as corruption. But now, to at least some good news is, since 2 decades ago, you see now that there is this core and emerging trend where we see human rights practitioners, anti-corruption defenders working together, because together they can achieve more than what they can achieve if they are to work alone. So look at human rights experts, lawyers. They bring in expertise in victims, remedies, accountability. There are also the mechanisms that they use, like courts, regional courts, semi-judicial institutions, specifically designed to address human rights issues. Whereas anti-corruption activists, they also have serious expertise in investigations, financial crimes, asset recovery, which if these are combined, can actually better enhance the work of each other. So to give an example, if assets are to be recovered by anti-corruption practitioners, they can be channeled towards the payment of reparations by human rights practitioners. So there is so much to gain from working together than from working in silos, to continue working in silos. And also, they can then use each other's mechanisms. So anti-corruption practitioners can then approach human rights courts, or traditionally human rights mechanisms, to also address issues that are related to corruption or human rights violations that may have been instigated by or through corruption.
It's very interesting you say that. Yesterday, we were having a conversation internally about one of our cases in one of the countries we are working in. There's a reparations or a compensation commission after a transitional justice process, and we were following up on payment of outstanding compensation. And the story was, we are waiting for money to come back from some foreign country as proceeds of sale of a property from one of the perpetrators, and that money would then be used, hopefully, to pay compensation to the victims. So there are actually live issues that attest to what you are saying now. Now, let's talk about victims. One of the arguments that you push, you said it now, and I read it in the document, which I had the pleasure to read, which we will launch later in the month, a report. But you push the argument of saying, let's move away from viewing corruption as a victimless crime. It's a crime, that is actual victims. Now, from a litigant's perspective, or from a litigator's perspective, how would one frame this argument, this submission to pass, the test or legal standards around legal standing and admissibility, moving into the technical issues now, because those are real issues that one would immediately face when they go to a court to petition anti-corruption as a human rights issue. How does one frame that argument to pass those legal hurdles?
Yes, Musa, absolutely right. Yeah. One of the biggest, and I say misconception, is that corruption is a victimless crime. Yeah, you hear or you see in the newspaper main headline, $40 million missing from the secretariat or from finance. And you go, you check in your bank account, your money is there, your $200 is there. So you say, oh, but whose money was stolen? Corruption is a victimless crime. So that has been a misconception. And a human rights approach changes that completely. Yeah? It places victims right at the center of the discussion. And let me give an example. So for litigation, why is this important? So if practitioners are able to demonstrate that corruption has resulted in a violation of identifiable rights of an identifiable individual, that can strengthen their argument, including on standing and admissibility. I hope, Musa, you will later give me the opportunity to discuss a few cases to illustrate how this issue of having an actual victim who can testify or attest before the courts that their rights have been violated, how that can really change the equation and really help a litigant or at least a party to prove a case against corruption. I don't know why the paper's on my side, but anyway, courts are often more willing to intervene where applicants can show not only that corruption has occurred, but also that it has deprived people of their rights, whether it's right to education, healthcare, clean water, housing, or other protected rights, and that those people can be identified. So you don't just come and allege that rights have been violated without showing the actual litigant. So you need to show the litigant. By showing the litigant, the victim, that can then help with the issues of who has the standing. So who are you, for example, as the institution? Who are you? Why are you bringing this case? How is that affecting you? But you say, oh, we are here because you are representing Mr. X, who is actually a victim of a specific act of corruption. That proves that already satisfies the standing requirement and also therefore the admissibility. So having the victim, having an individual, having a face can then help to prove or strengthen arguments on legal standing and admissibility.
Yes, so I'll give you the chance now to speak about the cases. So why don't we jump into it now?
Yes.
You actually have done in this publication, in your previous work, a survey of a lot of domestic cases that have been taken to national courts on this. But at IHRDA, we are much more interested in the regional human rights system in Africa. The ECOWAS Court of Justice, the African Court on Human and People's Rights, the East African Court of Justice, the Children's Committee in Lesotho, but also the African Commission on Human and People's Rights here in Banjul, where I'm sitting now. What you find is that there is a dearth of cases, very few cases that have been taken before the 5 regional mechanism on anything to do with corruption. And I'm interested to really understand why. We can talk later on about, what can be done, but I'm interested in understanding why we have such a dearth of cases. And as you respond to that, you may also share with us some of the cases that have come up and what lessons have emerged out of those cases.
Yes, thanks, Musa. That's also absolutely really fantastic, a very good observation. Indeed, we do have several regional mechanisms, I think more than any other region in the world. We have sub-regional courts, those regional economic courts, each one of them, with the exception now of the SADC, whose court it has been suspended for over a decade now. So the thing is that in Africa, we have quite a good number of forums. ECOWAS Court, East African Court of Justice, even at the regional level, we have the commission, we have the court itself. The challenge is not the absence of forums, but the limited number of cases that have been brought before them. So that's really a very good observation. So what practitioners present, I hope we have many of them, I can't see the number, but practitioners here present should consider these regional mechanisms, especially where domestic courts are ineffective or maybe compromised or for some reasons are unable to provide effective remedies. Let me give a few examples. So we have had a few cases that were very close to successful litigation. It's really depressing to say that of all the cases that have so far been brought before regional economic courts, there's none that is actually confirmed or settled the issue that corruption is a violation of human rights. But we are getting closer. So we have SERAP. I don't know if in the room we have people from Nigeria. They know this very important organization. The abbreviation is SERAP, S-E-R-A-P, versus Nigeria. And I think majority of the cases, probably 70% of the cases are on corruption and human rights nexus, on the corruption and human rights nexus are coming from SERAP. Yeah. So we have one case that they brought before the ECOWAS court. I think this was after President Obasanjo had made a television admission in a speech on television. He had admitted that billions of nairas were embezzled or stolen or unaccounted for in the education sector. So immediately, SERAP then filed a case before the ECOWAS court. So say because of corruption in the education sector, there is now, it amounts to a violation of the right to education. And it did, the court indeed agreed to an extent that SERAP managed to demonstrate that corruption and human rights can successfully be linked before a regional court. It agreed, the court agreed with SERAP, but the issue was on locus standi, standing. SERAP rushed to the court, to the ECOWAS court, armed with that admission, video clip and documents, video clip of Mr. Obasanjo admitting that money is missing, stolen, embezzled. But they didn't have a victim to show. So they were asked a simple question, but who are you then to file this? So they didn't have a victim to show as the actual victim of that particular corruption. Stolen funds, missing books, or salaries for teachers, etc., etc. So they didn't go that extra step. There have been other cases as well. I think SERAP has also filed a case, but this is an advisory opinion, also equally important. And in the guide, we are promoting both contentious cases, such as state versus or an NGO or an individual versus a state or an institution. But also, you can also approach the court, to seek its expertise in interpreting the provisions of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights as well as the African Charter. We also have a charter in Africa on anti-corruption. It's one of the oldest, even before UNCAC, the Universal Convention Against Corruption. And ask the judges to interpret the provisions of this convention, or even domestic laws that have domesticated this UN Convention Against Corruption, and see how they are, or the violation or acts of corruption as defined in any particular domestic, in any particular country, can be a violation of provisions in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights through advisory opinion. Again, SIRAP has tried that. But then the question was also still issues of admissibility. Certain issues were not met, and therefore the matter was never, decided on the basis of its merit. But nothing will stop an organization that have legal standing to approach the African Court on Human and People's Rights today and still ask the same questions that SIRAP was asking a few years ago. So we have had a few cases, quite promising. Then last, and then I'll shut up and allow you to move to the next question. We should also remember that there are certain cases that were brought on African issues against African institutions and individuals before international or third-party states. By third party, I mean states outside the African continent. This is also important. We need to look at, especially within our jurisprudence. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. We also borrow duty-free from other regions. So there have been cases that have been brought in other countries through colonial links, whether it's in the United Kingdom or elsewhere, that have also helped to shape and interpret provisions of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights in terms of whether corruption can be a violation of this law. One interesting case, not directly a corruption case, was brought. It was an interstate case between Congo and Guinea, one of the Guineas, Guinea-Bissau, where Guinea-Bissau took a case for the International Court of Justice on behalf of their citizens. I can hear myself. Is there a problem?
Yes, I can hear. There is a bit of echo. I think our Janice will attend to that. If Janice, you can hear us.
Okay, very quickly. So, but the thing is, colleagues, a case was taken before the International Court of Justice by Guinea. Did I say Guinea-Bissau? Yeah, on behalf of its citizen, Mr. Diallo, I think that was his name, because his businesses were confiscated to the state, and he was then unlawfully arrested. This is not just a case of human rights violation, unlawful arrest, denial of your right to property. If, for those who are familiar with Zaire's Mobutu, it was the most corrupt. In fact, the word kleptocracy was created with people like Mobutu Sese Seko in mind. He was one of the most corrupt African leaders ever. So you can then see that if then the ICJ passes a verdict to say that, a decision to say that the acts, or because of certain acts or omissions by a state on so and so can amount to a violation of human rights. That's also another way to say that because of illegal arrest, because arresting somebody illegally, because greedy politicians want to grab their property. This is absolute corruption. There is a link now between corruption and the violation of human rights. So litigators in the room, be creative. Use such cases. You don't really have to look for the C word all the time. Look for those cases and then be creative to use them strategically to argue that corruption can be a violation of human rights. And this is good precedent. No better precedent than one that is coming from the International Court of Justice. So these are some of the cases. So we need also to look beyond Africa, not only on African issues, but also on other similar issues. I believe, and I'll have time to discuss this hopefully. The inter-Americans, they also have quite similar issues to ours. So as Asia, they also have similar issues to ours. So this is where, like in any other situations, we can also borrow from other regions.
Thank you so much. So, colleagues, I will ask those in the room to mute their gadgets. We can hear some interfering voices. But thank you, Simba. We are not trying to reinvent the wheel. That's what you are telling us. There is a lot that we can get from other jurisdictions that have traveled this journey before us. I mean, you gave us, the Guinea example just now, but one of the Guineas, Equatorial Guinea, it was in the video that was played at the beginning. There was also a case I came across that was taken in 2014, way back before the African Commission here in Banjul. It's called APDHE versus Equatorial Guinea, brought by an NGO. It was directly challenging diversion of state resources and natural resources by the ruling family for private benefit, whilst maintaining a corrupt system that was starving funding of public services. Unfortunately, that case was thrown out because of non-exhaustion of local remedies. So some of the technical issues that litigants and litigators need to think about as they bring cases. So because of that, unfortunately, the commission itself has not pronounced on the issue of corruption directly. Neither has the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child been confronted. Of their 29 cases, they haven't been confronted directly by a corruption case. I see you want to make a comment on this. Go ahead.
Oh, it's a very quick one.
Yes.
When so many anecdotes to share. So, colleagues, this is just an anecdote. It's not part of the guide, but it's a very important one. The Equatorial Guinea clan, or can I just, very specific, Teodoring, the vice president of Equatorial Guinea, who is the subject of various corruption cases across the globe, from South Africa to New York, Netherlands, Switzerland. He has been subject to all these different cases. But there is a lot. If you are to really want to learn, to build, to get very good appreciation of how corruption can be a violation of human rights, cases against Mr. Teodoring Obiang Nguema are very illustrative. It's unfortunate in this case, as Musa mentioned, procedural issues. I think it was admissibility, exhaustion of domestic remedies. They still continue to limit the development of jurisprudence. But you can look elsewhere. There are cases that have been successfully brought against him, including, again, to go back to the International Court of Justice, although it did not really rule that, or did not give a decision that Mr. Obiang is corrupt. The decision that they gave in a case that was Equatorial Guinea against France, and then went again. France first, it was France versus Equatorial Guinea, and I think 2 cases, then third round, it was Equatorial Guinea versus France. They made a decision that Mr. Nguema is not immune to prosecution. He can be prosecuted in France for acts that he committed before he was vice president of that country. And these are some of the important issues that can be raised, issues of immunity. But this is also important for issues of forum selection. Musa, you don't want to hear about forum shopping, but so forum selection, which is very important when we are talking about corruption issues. Which forum we gave? I mentioned there that we have quite a number of regional mechanisms in Africa, but we should also be very clear with this number, of mechanisms. We should also be careful on which one is the most appropriate to choose before we file our case. That was just an anecdote.
Great, thanks for sharing that. That's an important anecdote nonetheless. So I have a lot of questions to ask Simba here, but I'm keen to also hear from you, the audience. If you have any question, any comment that you want to put on the table for Simba to look at, please write on the chat. But if you raise your hand, we will also be able to see you and we'll give you an opportunity to make your comment. But while we wait for that, I want to follow up on this. So from the little jurisprudence there is in the African human rights system, there is recognition that corruption is an insidious practice that is undermining development and rule of law, but there is no established precedent, at least, that defines corruption as a human rights issue. Never mind the link between corruption and human rights, but defining corruption itself as a human rights issue. From a conceptual standpoint, do you think this should change? Should we move to defining corruption itself as a human rights violation, not as an aid to violation, but as a violation itself?
Yes, that's also very interesting question, Musa. Once you ask me this question, I can spend the whole afternoon, unpacking it. But I'll be very brief as much as possible.
Yes,
against
sure.
my will. first, colleagues, let me start with this. When you're fighting, you don't start by throwing your nukes. You don't just send immediately your nuclear weapon. We saw it, maybe not a very good example. I'm so sorry, lives were lost, but you saw the fight between Israel and Iran. Nobody has sent a nuclear so far. We don't know. Iran may have some nuclear weapons, but they are still sending the drones and stuff. That's also important as a strategic litigator. You should also be very strategic in what you ask the court to do. Musa, you probably, when you joined, sorry, colleagues, I'm now bringing too many, and we brought a very important case before the SADC tribunal, very important, but too big that we then choked the court. Yeah, the young court was then choked. As a baby, you don't start giving a baby adult food. You start giving it porridge and other, Yeah. But what I'm trying to say here, colleagues, is that let's look at the relationship between corruption and human rights from three angles. Or is a continuum. But let's look at it. Yeah, we have the extreme end, we have the other end, two extreme ends, and we have also a point in between. So the sort of weaker point, I say weaker point because it really doesn't attribute or challenge courts to say that pronounce corruption as a human rights violation. This is treating corruption as an issue. Yeah, and this is not. It's still important. Corruption is an issue or in human rights, or human rights is an issue within corruption. So just that link is also very important. Yeah? This is what we call the human rights-based approach. So you bring in all the other human rights mechanisms, the human rights-based approach, accountability, transparency, and so forth and so on to the fight against corruption, which so far is quite difficult. You can't fight corruption if there's no transparency, if there's no any mechanism to force government officials, for example, to declaration of what they owe before they assume public office. So if you include the human rights-based approach into the fight against corruption, for example, then you can legally force a person who is elected into office to declare their assets immediately on assuming office. So making corruption an issue, yeah, or one that can contribute to the violation of human rights, even if it doesn't lead to the violation itself, but it does contribute to the violation of human rights, is also very important. And this guide can help you, or if you want to make that argument, to only link corruption as an issue in human rights violations. But then there is, on the other extreme, I'll come back to the midpoint. On the other extreme, the very strong, the strongest side view is to see, to argue for the right to freedom from corruption. I was almost said the right to corruption. There's no right to corruption. Unless if you belong to the ruling elite. Yeah, but the right to freedom from corruption. So some are saying, let's go even beyond an issue and say that there should be a fundamental, standalone human right to be free from corruption. And there's been some enormous and very convincing writings, as far back as Aristotle, where they argue that, it is without, freedom from corruption, there's no human dignity. So there is a right to be free from corruption. One, and then I'll move to one writer, I think is based in India. He made an argument that if, for instance, a security guard who is underpaid, who can go on for 10 months without getting a salary, and I'm sure colleagues, if you come from certain parts of Africa, this is happening every day. Yeah? And they say that person can argue in the highest court in that particular country that my right to freedom from corruption has been violated. They put me at this station 10 months without payment, and I'm expected to pay bus fare every day to come to work. So if somebody offers me a bribe, I am in a situation where I have to accept this bribe. So this is a violation of my right to freedom from being corrupted. That's just a mood. It's more academic now, but I believe if really strongly crafted, this can make a very good case. And there are other writings I'm free to share, but they are also in the guide anyway. Then there is the midpoint, which is the one that is most practical if you are pragmatic, to treat corruption as a human rights violation in itself. Yeah? So where we say corruption is the violation of human rights in this particular case. So here you have to look at, if there is any link between a specific act of corruption to the violation of human rights. Let's go to the Serap case, Serap versus Nigeria. So money was embezzled, embezzled in the Ministry of Education. For argument's sake, let's say $5 billion. And then you go to schools in Nigeria, let's say you go to some state, and then you see that they don't have, the teachers have not been paid their salary for a year. There's no proper equipment in the school. There are no books, nothing. Then you can actually make a strong link here. The causal connection. Stolen funds, no materials, no salaries for teachers. There is a clear connection here between these missing funds and the payment of salaries. So there is a clear connection here. And then you can also attribute this to the state, because the state should be responsible. Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Kenya, or any other state that has signed the African Charter or Conventions Against Corruption, the UN Convention Against Corruption, they are responsible to ensure that they pass legislation that criminalizes acts of corruption, and they should arrest those ministers who are believed to corrupt and investigate and convict them if they are found to be guilty. So if you only just read on TV that so-and-so was, or money is missing, and you don't make any follow-up arrest, there is a violation. So in this case, clearly corruption is a violation of that particular right to education, and could be also more, because rights are interlinked, and but I think I've taken too much time on this.
No, clearly you have been thinking long and hard about these issues, Simba, which is really fantastic, and that's why we have you here. So you are there is an incremental approach here to be talking about, which you are pushing. You have also given us a continuum, rights as an corruption as an issue, corruption as the violation, and then the other side, freedom from corruption as a right, which is the other end. And hopefully we get there at some point, because it is a right to be free from corruption. So thanks for that. So it's a good point to then talk about case selection, right? And here we would want your own expert, insights and advice around how practitioners in the room can start thinking about it. So you have grant corruption, you have petty corruption, you have corruption that is, perpetrated by government officials. You have corruption done by non-state actors, and then the state fails to hold those non-state actors to account. It's also an issue. What kind of issues do you see cases as having perhaps the most promise to be taken up before courts, particularly regional courts, as a starting point, particularly now because we are talking about a death or a shortage of cases? What kind of cases offer the most promise? So we are talking about case selection now, if you have any insights to share.
Yes. Yeah, fantastic. Good question. It was a very important question, Musa. But first, a disclaimer, being too academic now. But thing is, they always want to put a disclaimer, when academics are speaking or writing, disclaimer this, disclaimer that. A very important disclaimer here. A case doesn't come screaming, I'm strategic, like something like that. You never know. Depending on what you have, you can start with a very simple, ordinary case that can then develop into a strategic case because of the legal principles that it establishes. But more importantly, it's important to note, colleagues, that corruption and human rights cases, there are no special exception to any other case. They should satisfy, especially if they are being brought before regional and international courts. They should satisfy the same legal requirements as any other case, including jurisdiction, admissibility, and standing. They should also, the merit side, should be at least some reasonable prospects of success and the potential to create broader legal or social impact. Having said that, we come back now to the issue of corruption. This is where it's important now to have anti-corruption experts in the room, together with human rights practitioners, because anti-corruption experts, they know that whenever you are dealing with corruption, you have to distinguish it, unpack it, deconstruct it to its different forms, categories. So the most common one, and I'll use the most common one, grant and petty corruption. So grant corruption, top drawer corruption. This is World Cup kind of corruption. Then we have petty corruption, which is the high school or those guys kind of football. But that distinction, legally speaking, doesn't make much of a difference, and here's why. So with grant corruption cases, of course, they offer the greatest opportunity for strategic litigation. You have a case that is sound enough, large amounts of money involved, probably maybe easier also. not so easy, but there can be some tracks that you can follow. Yeah? And also, you can't approach a regional international court with something that's not really, that's trivial. So grant corruption usually offer the greatest opportunity for strategic litigation. The results will also lead to broader reforms. But having said that, ordinary case or so-called petty corruption, petty corruption occurs where individuals meet, let's say, this is where administrators meet the public. Yeah? That rural area security guard, municipal police officer meets the citizen who wants to access a local village clinic. They ask for $5 US. That's petty. That's considered petty compared to $40 billion missing at the state level. So thing is, even denying the woman or an old woman access to getting a monthly medication because she didn't provide $1 can also violate a human right, a right to health and maybe other rights. And if in an unfortunate situation, she may die as a result. That is also a violation of human rights. But and if that issue is addressed, probably through paying enough adequate salaries to all these state, law enforcement guys, that can really change the state of corruption and human rights enjoyment for that particular area. So you have to look, each particular case, you should look at it on its own merits. But of course, grant corruption usually offers a very straightforward entry point into the link between corruption and human rights because of the resources that are involved. And if you are to use, let's say, a case of socioeconomic rights, then you can easily argue that because resources are not available and because the law is quite clear, you need resources to satisfy socioeconomic rights. Therefore, because of these missing billions, there is a case of corruption. But after saying that, having said that, let's also not dismiss even the pettiest of these cases, as you never know the legal principles that it may establish. That's why in the guide, we're quite flexible to an extent to make sure that it's written from a perspective that anybody, depending on any case, you can use it to argue that petty corruption or grant corruption is a violation of human rights or maybe a human rights issue.
Yeah. Human rights violations are human rights violations, petty or grant. So some good points there, both on the technical side, but also on the strategy side in terms of deciding what kind of cases would make sense. Let's talk about the challenges now. So when you are fighting corruption, you are usually fighting money, resources. You're fighting actors with resources, actors with some kind of power, including vested interests, sometimes political protection, etc., etc. What are some of the challenges that a litigant or a litigator should keep in mind? Potential pitfalls that might defeat their endeavors or affect them in some negative way as they pursue this. I'm looking at both technical challenges in terms of procedure, but also political challenges that one must build in to their thinking. Do you have any insight on that?
Well, I also, when I share, these are just from my personal but also professional experiences, but I believe colleagues here, they also probably have experienced something. And please feel free, if you also want to share in a comment what you think may also be a useful challenge that needs to be taken into account. We can probably also integrate it into the guide. The guide is still under development. So,
absolutely,
very important point, corruption fights back. Corruption is unlike if some other crimes, corruption fights back. Those who are corrupt, they are also quite very cruel. And especially now where we see that, especially in some many African countries, we seem to have a third sector that is emerging. We have the public sector, we have the private sector, also very rich and powerful. We now have a criminal sector that is emerging. These people are very rich without any source of any known source of income, but they are extremely rich. They show they are wealthy on social media. This is the criminal sector that is emerging. And what's more depressing, we now see that the three are now together in bed. So what happened in South Africa, state capture, where we now have the criminals. These criminals, they have captured the state. They have the politicians in their hand. So these people are very difficult to fight. They have the law enforcement in their pocket. They have the judges in their pocket. They have the prison officers in their pocket, the prison wardens. So political pressure is one of the most important, I think, challenge, political pressure. Then there is intimidation itself. It can get serious, torture, limited access to evidence. Corruption happens behind closed doors and drawn curtains in some cases. Although now we also see it happening in broad daylight in some states. We have some people without any, as I said, any known source of income. You see them buying a very expensive jet. This is corruption that is happening in broad daylight. We see now lawyers being paid exorbitant fees in broad daylight, sometimes even on social media. This is corruption that is happening. But linking now the evidence to the specific acts can be very difficult, easier said than done. Then there is also the length proceedings. They will exhaust you. The corrupt can afford to hire the most expensive defense counsels. So they will make the proceedings very lengthy, more expensive, just to frustrate. Then you have human rights defenders, journalists, anti-corruption activists. They face personal risks. Fighting corruption comes at a personal risk. So you can be abducted. You can even be killed. We have cases. I don't know if we have people from South Africa in the room. There's the Babita case, the whistleblower in this that scandal that they set up a commission at the moment, the procurement scandal. She was, then some people were hired, they killed her. They are not even talking even today. They don't say who actually sent them, but they are there. So it comes at a very terrible personal risk. So this is precisely why strategic litigation requires careful preparation, collaboration, and institutional support. In some of the cases that I've shared in the guide, you see that those who are fighting are based abroad. So that's why it's, as I always emphasize, it's important to link African mechanisms to other important mechanisms in countries where you think enforcement or there is better protection of human rights defenders, journalists, and anti-corruption activists. So you can link this. So be strategic even as you prepare a case. Move or send to some people who can then file on your behalf and just do the other background work without raising the suspicion of those who are in power and still very much in control and very corrupt.
Yes, yes. Corruption fights back. That's an important point. So perhaps the kind of challenges one faces dealing with this kind of cases are more than what one would find when they are dealing with an ordinary human rights issue. I mean, you remind me of a conversation we had some years back, you and I, on some platform also, and we spoke about corruption and torture, the link between corruption and torture. And you did allude to it briefly here, how corruption is very much linked to some of the many human rights issues that we fight, including torture, as a form of corruption fighting back, but also corruption as an inducement to the practice of torture, which is still prevalent on the continent. As you say, corrupt people are able to hire some of the most expensive lawyers. They can buy judges, etc. And I think we know that it takes lawyers and judges to advance rule of law, but it also takes lawyers and judges to defeat rule of law, because they are also actors, in the legal and judicial profession, fighting these things. So let's talk about success, and we will link that to remedies and enforcement. And the question basically is, what does success in anti-corruption, in litigating anti-corruption as a human rights issue look like? In the context of Africa particularly, we have a notorious challenge of enforcement. I'm talking about generally, and I'm sure it will even be much worse when it comes to corruption, because you are talking about, issues like asset recovery, you are talking about issues of prosecuting perpetrators who are powerful actors, etc. What does success look like for you? And how do we navigate the issue of enforceability of remedies?
Yeah, thanks, Musa. Two questions there. So there's the success, then there's the enforcement. So first, and I always tell this even to my students, that success is not measured only by winning a case. Sometimes, especially in strategic litigation, you can also win by losing. So by losing a case, you have already won because it raises public awareness, changes public debate, or prompts even some institutional reforms, especially from within. So success don't worry about losing or winning a case. You can also win by losing a case. But of course, if you win a case, that's fair and that's really actually the most desirable result. Then there is the enforcement, which is a different ballroom altogether. Yeah. So enforcement is a challenge. Well, first, maybe we link this to the issue of remedies, yeah? Depending, of course, on what sort of remedies that you are seeking. Sometimes you just want you want a declaration. It can be important. A declaration of rights, declaring that there is a right to education, emphasizing that there is a right to education that should be protected. But beyond that, there should be restitution, the most important remedy. This is a fundamental right, the right to remedy. Restitution where possible. Then institutional reforms. It's important. We can't even return assets to the same corrupt state. There should be some immediate institutional reforms, transparent measures, accountability, to make sure that, because most of these highly corrupt countries, especially where you see this unholy alliance between corruption and human rights, there is some sort of vicious cycle. So you have those who are corrupt, then there is ironclad impunity, which encourages more corruption. And then again, so you are caught up in that. So once you, as some remedy to break that kind of system, change that negative into a positive loop, a virtuous cycle, where then you cut the impunity, immunity that is given de facto, de jure, and then hold those who are corrupt accountable, public officials, and where necessary or where it's possible, asset recovery. So these are the remedies. So depending on the remedies, then there's the issue of enforcement. Enforcement is quite challenging, not only in our region in Africa, but elsewhere, especially when it comes to asset recovery. Yeah. So this is where now you need to use other means, other mechanisms, even beyond the region. And again, here I refer us to the international level. We have UNCAC, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. The specific chapter on asset recovery that is in UNCAC is there as a result of the African Union. Yeah? Let's not forget, this whole webinar today is commemorating the AU's anti-corruption theme. It is the African Union that actually proposed for the 5 on asset recovery in the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. Let's use those international mechanisms. Once you're armed with a decision from a regional court, use this regional decision, and force it even outside. The good thing nowadays is, even with those corrupt, they don't want to hide their money under the mattress in their countries or even in banks, local banks. Their money is elsewhere. It doesn't matter, even if it's in Dubai or if it's in another corrupt country, most of these transactions are done in US dollars. And once there is that US dollar element, then there is the jurisdiction of the Americans. Then you use the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act to then get some remedies under that and in the United States that can allow you to attach properties of the corrupt. The Equatorial Guinea case, the Americans were able to resolve it quite well, at least to an extent satisfactorily, because they seized the assets, sold them, and then repatriated the money back to buy vaccines, COVID vaccines for the people of Equatorial Guinea. In Nigeria, there are funds that were stolen, money that was stolen by James Ibori, the very corrupt governor from one of the states in Nigeria. That money is in the process. It's coming back to Nigeria in installments, and it's now being properly used. And there is also, again, you see this alliance between international development partners, NGOs, NPOs. They are helping now with the repatriation of the stolen funds. That's also a very important step of enforcement. So enforcement depends on a number of issues, but also on that alliance between human rights practitioners and anti-corruption practitioners. So they identify the needs, they have mechanisms in place to distribute the funds or to manage the funds, and so forth and so on. But all depends, as a lawyer, legally speaking, and because this is also a guide on strategic litigation, I rely on international law and legal mechanisms to ensure enforcement. But also, without being cynical, as you know, that under international law, we don't really have an international police as such. But
Yeah.
nonetheless, international law is still law, and in most cases, it is being respected. So
Yeah.
we resort to international mechanisms to enforce decisions by regional courts, even decisions by domestic courts. Let's then get them registered or acknowledged by international courts and semi-judicial institutions. So
Yes.
I hope my answer became a bit too long, but
Absolutely.
I hope it makes
No,
sense.
no, you were quite clear, and you challenged us to think a bit more broadly in terms of both remedies and how we approach enforcement. But I want to pause here and open the floor. I don't see any questions in the chat room. I don't see any hands that are up, but let me pause here and allow the audience an opportunity to ask questions or make comments. Is there anyone who would want to say something? You may raise your hand, I'll be able to see you. You may throw a comment in the chat box, I'll be able to see it as well. Okay, none for now. All right, great. So let's speak about looking ahead, Simba. And again, I'm more
Okay,
interested.
can I ask questions to Professor Simba?
Yes, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
So how Professor Simba see the corruptions trend comparison between Africa and Asia, especially in the third world country. Yeah, because do they have the same pattern and trend or different? Because I see, of course, between the European, USA country, it's quite different with Asia and Africa. That is my questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sariat, for that question. Simba, I hope you took it down. You took that question down. And is there any other question? There's a long chat that I'll go to now. But for now, did you pick that question? Do you want to respond to that?
Oh, yeah, yes, I can. I think I can quickly respond to it. Yeah,
Please go
thank you,
ahead.
Sariat. Thank you. Good to see you. Colleagues and others also listen for the benefit of everybody. Yeah. So corruption corruption itself is still debatable. How do we even define it? Especially the criminal aspect. There is not even consensus on what exactly is corruption. Having said that, there are certain acts or certain standards that we agree that this, at least at the international level, they've agreed. UNCAC, they said, no, this should be criminalized. And then others are optional. Now, after saying, it's a good thing that we don't have a specific definition, even in international instruments. Remember, colleagues, we are going to be using strategic litigation based on international instruments such as UNCAC and the domesticated acts based on UNCAC, which does not have a definition. A very good thing, yeah, lack of a definition. Why am I saying so? Corruption is like a moving target, Saraj. If you are in the force, yeah, it's a moving target. It changes speed and height at the same time, depending on so many things, technology and so forth and so on. Now money can be sent at the speed of a button. So that also has changed corruption somehow. In terms of the trends or what we are talking about, sometimes we're actually talking about perceptions of corruption, especially when it comes to who is more corrupt than another. We talk of perceptions. We can't not really know strictly, with confidence and with certainty that Asia is more corrupt than Africa, because some of it happens behind, as I say, closed doors and drawn curtains. But the perceptions are showing, if you read, let's say, the most read corruption index, corruption index, the Transparency International CPI, it shows that Africa is the most corrupt region in the world. So you look there, you see that most of it is darker. So that's a sign that there is more corruption. Perceived levels of corruption are higher in Africa. And Asia follows, not so far ahead, very close together. Asia is also very close to Africa when it comes to corruption. So they are not so much, but in terms of the trends, we see that the trends are also, there is this emerging disturbing alliances I mentioned, that we now have super rich people who are now capturing the state. So there is now state capture. Either in Asia, in Africa, we now see this as an emerging trend. People who have made money, embezzled money, sometimes long back, they use that money to they launder it, huh? And then they also launder their reputation in the process. And they come back even as your heads of state. Here we have seen in Indonesia, the son-in-law of Suharto is now back as the president. We have seen Ferdinand Marcos' son, one of the most corrupt head of state ever. He is now back in power. We have seen Fujimori winning an election just 2 weeks or so ago in Latin America. Fujimori's father was one of also the most corrupt person in the world. So there is that unholy alliance where money is now being used to get people back into power. And an election, especially an election in your country, Sarat, it's one of the most expensive things. To be elected a member of parliament in Indonesia, you need at least $2 million US to give as gratuities. This is not a gratuity. This is not Baroka. This is corruption. So there is this emerging disturbing trend. Corruption, politics, human rights, governance together. So that's why in the beginning, Musa started by saying that corruption is beyond a governance failure now. Yeah, it's beyond a criminal issue. It is now also encroaching into a human rights issue.
Yeah.
So I hope I've answered this satisfactorily.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you so much. Comparative perspectives are always interesting. There's a long comment in the chat from Paledi. I'm not going to talk to read it out, but you can all go and read it. There's a paper that is in the making, and it's exploring, multiple avenues of liability, from criminal liability to civil liabilities, including some constitutional dimensions to that. I mean, we look forward to that, to the outcomes of that paper. It looks interesting. And then Ishe Anesu Chirisa, good to have you in the room, Anesu. She has a question for you, Prof. She wants to know whether the African Union and the UN corruption frameworks or anti-corruption frameworks have provisions around blacklisting of corrupt public officials.
Yeah, that's
Yes.
a very good question. Doctrinal, Anesu, this is a very good question, and one that can also be linked to the guide, by the way, because not only is the issue of blacklisting important, it also shows the issues of immunity that is granted to some of these people, public officials. And we know that in some cases, especially when you're talking about corruption, the other side is a public official who may have embezzled, received a bribe, and so forth and so on. But they may be untouchable because of immunity. So under let's look at the African mechanism, quite clear. All these heads of state, sitting heads of state, public officials, they, to an extent, enjoy immunity. Yeah? So there is de jure immunity, and therefore they cannot be blacklisted unless and until there is some conviction. And even with this conviction, the UNCAC doesn't really provide or suggest it to states that they need to blacklist public officials. It is up to member states to decide how then they deal with corruption issue. Of course, after a conviction, would they then ban those officials from holding office for the next 15 years or for life? This is left to member states. UNCAC is one of the weakest convention, regardless of being a very universal, near universal declaration. But remember, comrades, colleagues, this is a document that is passed by the United Nations General Assembly, which requires a lot of compromises to pass. So some of its provisions are quite weak. So it doesn't really have the mechanism to name and shame. This is unheard of under UNCAC, both UNCAC and African procedures. Happy to say, Anesu, that there are now other mechanisms. Well, you may, given the situation in the US now, people will not want to use any borrow examples from there. They have something there that is called, the laws they call the Global Magnitsky Act. The US always want to pass for everybody. So they even call them Global Magnitsky legislation. This piece of law is passed in recognition of a whistleblower and a lawyer who was tortured and killed eventually for blowing the whistle against corruption involving billions of dollars in Russia. So anybody who is corrupt, but also is probably linked to government official or is a politically exposed person, meaning he has close relationship to those in power, can be not only named and shamed, under that act, but they can also have their assets in the US seized and confiscated to the state, and they are not allowed to travel to the state, for example. There's some all sorts of legal embargoes against those people, including in many countries. In Zimbabwe, we have people sanctioned under the Global Magnitsky Act. In Nigeria, in Angola, in Uganda, many countries in South Africa, we have people who have also been sanctioned under this. So that's some form of blacklist. It doesn't exist under the African Union and the UN, but it does exist under certain states. They have this, but this is posing a challenge. Colleagues will discuss this also in the guide, but we discussed there's the issue now of unilateral sanctions. Unilateral sanctions, do they go a bit too far? The UN Charter itself does not really talk of unilateral sanctions. Sanctions should come from, they should be collective. But we now see an emerging trend of unilateral sanctions against the human rights violators and those who are corrupt. So there is an emerging trend outside the UNCAC and AU procedures.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. I think that was a very comprehensive response. Chris Owala, your hand is up. Please go ahead and unmute. We have about 15 minutes or so remaining, so we will take the last round of hands, and then I will ask you a parting question, and then we will bring this to a close. Chris, if you can hear me, please go ahead. You're on mute, Chris, if you are speaking. Okay, I don't know if Chris is there or not, but I see Marian as a comment.
Are you able to hear me now?
Chris, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for this question or this debate, which is very dear to my heart. I listened to your presentation on how to tie corruption and human rights. I work with a civil society organization based in western part of Kenya. I go to court to litigate on public interest. Many a times you move to court with a matter of public interest, also tying corruption to let's say to healthcare, corruption in employment, where government has not given adequate staff to promote right to healthcare. Many a times the court tend to defeat it in the process of evidence, but not because evidence is lacking, but because courts are not yet orientated to look at the human right as part of the degree. The way it's supposed to, is there in theory, but the practice contradict what happens, because even the courts themselves, they do bidding with the cases. And when they see because the cases of human rights are always big in nature, the implication is huge. When you win, it means that even the whole government will go down. And in many cases, you realize the judges are appointed by the same government. The ruling always protects the government. The enforcement becomes difficult, even if you're given a ruling. So what I'm asking, if the court cannot implement or enforce the ruling done by court, or in some cases, the threshold of evidence is put too high, what are the options left for civil society? Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Chris. A very good comment and question. Simba, if you can respond to that very briefly.
Indeed. That is a comment, but also I see there's some questions still lingering there. Thanks very much, Chris, for sharing your court experience. That's why the reason for this guide. We hope that it will encourage practitioners to litigate, to build jurisprudence that can clarify issues of evidence, what sort of threshold is required, and strengthen the link between corruption and human rights. I'll give one good example, as I mentioned. For instance, if you look at socioeconomic rights, they are, to me, one of the clearest way in which to show that there is a violation of human rights as a result of corruption. It's even more difficult to go and argue for your right to education, or for your right to health, or for your right to food, than it is to argue that because of the money that was stolen by the minister or by the one who was in charge of food distribution, therefore my right was denied to have access to a bag of rice or a bag of maize meal, and so forth and so on. Thing now is this. Every case, of course, is different. This guide is written in such a way that it does generalize and give some strategic ways of thinking, but let's not hesitate. Let's join hands, civil society practitioners, human rights institutions, anti-corruption agencies. Let's join hands to prepare very strategic cases. Let's also use the most advanced technologies and things that can help us, because in most cases, judges or other people involved, they are not familiar with some of these emerging issues, even that criminals are using to corrupt politicians. There's cryptocurrency that have been used, and then you go and you find out the judge has never heard that there's that form of currency that is called cryptocurrency. So we need also to be a step ahead. Whether we are arguing using technology, let's also use AI. Yeah, let's also use AI, understand it, and also use it, for instance, to prepare to, diagrams that can show. Seeing is believing. Show them how money left a proper trail, footprint that links money stolen in Kenya to a bank in Manhattan, or to a clearance account in New York and back to Dubai, where then it was used to buy a palatial home. Use all this information, AI, to show clearly and convince judges. These guys are always a step ahead. Let's also try to use the same mechanisms that these crooked people are using to get corrupted, or to move funds faster. But again, maybe in short, this is the reason why we have this guide. We will probably develop in a second edition to try to see how we can then discuss all these different tips, and also raise awareness, and also help to strategically think and prepare good cases. Of course, evidence will depend on each particular case, but also make sure that you really have a strong case in terms of evidence, and go beyond what's available locally, go beyond what you have learned in class, and see what else you can use, especially nowadays, in terms of coming up with strong, convincing evidence.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Prof. Chris, I hope you are answered there, or at least you got some pointers. But he makes important points about courts not being properly oriented, perhaps even fully capacitated to confront this big issue. Marian raises a comment there, and she's thanking you, Prof, for the engagement, and she suggests that this topic should be studied not just by legal experts, but it needs a multidisciplinary approach, more professionals than just lawyers and human rights defenders. And I couldn't agree more. And I think the guide that we are going to launch end of year will not just benefit lawyers and judges and human rights defenders, but others too. So I can already see that publication, is timely, and there's, important consumers who are waiting for it, who hopefully benefit in their own work. Now, I don't want us to overshoot time, so I'm going to ask you my last question, Prof. And it's as follows. This is a very dark topic. It's a topic that induces a lot of worry, a lot of concern. We don't know whether the courts are equipped to deal with this regionally, domestically, whether human rights defenders and lawyers have enough tools or enough resources to be able to confront this. But what gives you hope that there is going to be success in using anti-corruption litigation successfully as a human rights issue? What gives you hope, particularly because we are marking African Anti-Corruption Day? What gives you hope? And that will be my last question to you.
Yeah. I'm hopeless. No, I'm kidding. No, Musa, very symbolic. I even brought my gown with me. So this is my gown. Now we're talking of strategic litigation. But Musa, what gives me hope is that more people, especially on the African continent, are beginning to recognize that corruption is not only about stolen money. Yeah, it is about people. It is about the people, the victims of corruption. We are seeing now some greater collaboration between human rights organizations, anti-corruption institutions, academics, practitioners than ever before. This webinar is a testimony to that. You included me as a practitioner, as an academic, to work on this guide that will then be used by practitioners. So if we continue in that direction, placing victims right at the center of our work, and use strategic litigation alongside criminal justice measures. We are not saying let's stop criminal justice measures. Alongside criminal justice measures, let's also use strategic litigation. I believe that we can make some significant progress in fighting corruption. and also changing the narrative, Sarat, that Asia and Africa are the darkest continents in terms of corruption. It takes two to tango. But yeah, this is what gives me hope. That recognition alone, people seeing that there is something disturbing between corruption and human rights, this unholy alliance, that recognition gives me hope. And we need now to go beyond just recognizing it, test it in proper course of law. Chris, yeah, let's go to court. Let's keep on litigating.
Fantastic, brilliant as always, Simba. Always a pleasure engaging with you. We have just started a conversation and it's not going to end now and today. It's going to continue. Hopefully we'll have follow-up conversations and follow-up publications after this initial one. So thank you so much. And colleagues, thank you for what has been an engaging session. I want to cede the floor now back to Maimuna. Maimuna, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Simba and Dr. Kika. Thank you for sharing your insights with us today. Prof, you speak with so much passion despite it being a very complicated and difficult topic. And I'm glad that we ended on a note of hope. We will see you in court. So to everyone who has joined us, thank you very much for being part of this conversation. And we hope it sparked new ideas, that there is possibility to have collaborations to inspire action in the fight against corruption. And for those of you who are interested in learning more and reading IHRDA's latest publication, we'll be launching it very soon. I don't want to give a firm date yet, but within the next month. So please subscribe to our channels, follow us on social media, IHRDA across platforms, and visit our website. And that way you can stay up to date with all our latest publication and events, other webinars like this one, or conversations as we're calling them. And so this publication, just a reminder that it's the first in a new series of publications around practical strategic litigation guides. So today's conversation is also a first in a series of in-depth conversations with leading experts who are shaping the future of human rights litigation on the continent. So we look forward to bringing you lots more thought-provoking discussions in the months ahead. We're really happy that you could join us. Thanks for all your questions. And until next time, have a wonderful day. Thank you, Dr. Musa. Thank you, Professor Shimba. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks and bye-bye.